The cruelest thing about public humiliation is that it always comes with an audience. The ballroom of the Astoria Crown Hotel glowed beneath three massive crystal chandeliers worth more than most Piopre's homes. Waiters and white gloves moved between marble columns carrying silver trays filled with champagne flutes while a soft jazz piano drifted through the air like perfume. Every camera in Manhattan's business world seemed to be inside that room tonight, pointed at Ethan Whitmore, the rising corporate star who had just closed a $70 million merger before turning 38 years old. And beside him stood his wife, Naomi Carter, wearing a silver satin gown that caught the light every time she moved. She looked elegant without trying. Calm without effort. The kind of beauty that didn't beg to be seen because it already knew its worth. But Ethan hated that about her now. Ismail, he muttered through clenched teeth as another photographer snapped their picture near the ballroom staircase. Naomi obeyed quietly, though she could already smell the whiskey on his breath from 3 feet away. The crowd adored him tonight. Investors laughed at his jokes. Executives shook his hand like he was royalty. Ethan loved attention the way fire loved oxygen. And the more powerful he became, the colder he treated the woman who had once built his dreams beside him in a tiny Brooklyn apartment with broken heating and instant ramen dinners at 2 in the morning. Naomi reached for a champagne flute from a passing tray just as Ethan turned too quickly beside her. The edge of her glass brushed lightly against his tuxedo sleeve, leaving behind a tiny splash no bigger than a quarter. That should have been the end of it. But Ethan suddenly froze. Slowly, he looked down at the stain on his jacket. Then he laughed once under his breath. Cold. Sharp. Dangerous. Several nearby guests stopped talking. Naomi's stomach tightened. You always do this, Ethan said loudly enough for the surrounding circle to hear. Can't take you anywhere expensive. A few people exchanged awkward smiles. Naomi opened her mouth softly. Ethan, it was an accident, but before she could finish, he grabbed the full champagne flute from her hand and poured it directly over the front of her silver dress. Gasps sliced through the ballroom. Golden liquid cascaded down the satin fabric, dripping slowly onto the white marble floor beneath her heels. Someone near the bar covered their mouth to hide a laugh. Another woman whispered, "Oh my God," but she was smiling when she said it. Naomi stood completely still while cold champagne slid down her neck and arms. Camera phones quietly lifted into the air around the room. Ethan smirked as if he had just won something. Maybe now you'll learn how to hold a glass properly, he said. The piano music continued playing somewhere in the distance. But Naomi barely heard it anymore. Because across the ballroom, near the stage beneath the blue corporate lights, an older man in a black tuxedo had suddenly stopped walking the moment he saw her. The laughter did not last long. It started fading the second people noticed the older man near the stage was no longer speaking to the investors around him. He had gone completely still, one hand resting lightly against the stem of his untouched champagne glass while his eyes remained fixed on Naomi. The blue lights from the ballroom ceiling reflected against the silver in her dress, now stained darker from the champagne soaking through the fabric. Teeny droplets slid slowly down her forearm and onto the marble floor beside her heels. Ethan did not notice the shift in the room yet. He was too busy enjoying himself. Relax, everybody, he said with a careless grin as a few uncomfortable chuckles spread through the crowd again. My wife is dramatic. She will survive a little champagne. Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment. Not because she was ashamed. Because she was tired. Tired in the deep, quiet way that only came after years of swallowing humiliation in public while pretending everything was normal in private. Across the ballroom, cameras still hovered in the air. Some guests pretended not to stare while staring anyway. A woman in emerald earrings leaned toward her husband and whispered something into his ear before both of them smiled behind their glasses. Naomi had seen those smiles before. Country clubs. Corporate dinners. Charity auctions. Rooms where people measured worth by last names and stock portfolios. Ethan used to hate rooms like this too. 10 years ago, he had stood beside her inside a tiny apartment in Brooklyn wearing thrift store dress shirts and pitching business ideas from a folding card table beside the kitchen sink. Naomi remembered winter nights when the radiator barely worked and Ethan would stay awake until 3 in the morning rehearsing presentations while she corrected every slide beside him with a red pen. Back then, he used to hold her hand and call her his lucky charm. Back then, he looked at her like she mattered more than success. But money had changed the temperature of his soul. Slowly at first. Then all at once. The bigger the company became, the smaller Ethan made her feel beside it. Naomi reached for a linen napkin from a nearby table and gently pressed it against the champagne dripping from her wrist. Her movements stayed calm. Elegant. Controlled. That seemed to irritate Ethan even more. He stepped closer and lowered his voice just enough to sound cruel without causing another scene. You could at least pretend to be embarrassed. Naomi finally looked up at him. Her expression remained unreadable. I learned from watching you, she said softly. Ethan opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the ballroom speakers crackled overhead. The piano music faded out completely. A voice near the stage announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Hale & Rowe Industries. Mr. Alexander Hale." The entire atmosphere changed in seconds. Conversations died instantly. Executives straightened their jackets. Investors moved closer to the stage. Even Ethan turned toward the spotlight with sudden excitement flashing across his face. Alexander Hale was one of the most powerful men in American finance. Getting his attention could change a company overnight. But while the crowd applauded, Naomi noticed something strange. Alexander Hale was not looking at the stage entrance. It was still looking directly at her. Power changes the way people breathe around you. The moment Alexander Ali's name echoed through the ballroom speakers, the energy inside the Astoria Crown Hotel shifted like a sudden drop in temperature before a storm. Men who had been laughing seconds earlier immediately straightened their tuxedo jackets. Women adjusted diamond bracelets beneath the chandelier light. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as if someone had pressed pause on the entire room. Ethan Whitmore smiled instantly. Naomi recognized that smile. It was the smile he only used around people wealthier than him. More powerful than him. Important enough to improve his future. "This is perfect," Ethan whispered under his breath while adjusting the cufflinks on his sleeve. "If I can get 5 minutes with Hale tonight, everything changes." Naomi said nothing. Her champagne-soaked dress clung cold against her skin while the smell of expensive alcohol lingered in the air around her like a stain nobody wanted to acknowledge anymore. Water smoothed carefully through the ballroom collecting empty glasses as though pretending the scene from moments ago had never happened. But Naomi could still feel the eyes. The judgment. The quiet satisfaction some people felt after watching another woman get humiliated in public. Alexander Hale stepped toward the stage slowly, calm and composed beneath the soft blue lights overhead. He looked older than Naomi expected. Silver hair. Black tuxedo perfectly tailored. No flashy watch. No arrogance in the way he carried himself. Used presence. The kind of presence money could not buy because it came from years of being obeyed without ever needing to raise your voice. Applause thundered across the ballroom while photographers rushed closer to the stage. Ethan joined the applause enthusiastically. "That man controls half the market," he whispered to one of the investors beside him. "I heard his next acquisition is going to change Wall Street." Naomi kept watching Alexander quietly. And then she noticed something strange again. He still was not acknowledging the crowd. Not really. His eyes continued scanning the ballroom until they landed on her one more time. Steady. Intentional. Almost familiar. A young hostess approached Naomi. Nervously holding a fresh linen towel. "Ma'am, would you like assistance cleaning the dress?" Naomi offered a polite smile. "Thank you. I am fine." Ethan exhaled sharply beside her. "You could at least try to look less miserable tonight." Naomi turned toward him slowly. "I am not miserable, Ethan." "Then what are you?" His tone carried irritation now, quieter than before but sharper. Naomi looked past him toward the stage. A whack. Ethan frowned slightly, confused by the answer. On stage, Alexander finally stepped to the microphone. The ballroom became completely silent except for the faint hum of cameras recording every second. He rested one hand lightly against the podium and looked over the crowd with unreadable calm. Success, he began in a low steady voice, has a strange way of revealing character. A few executives nodded immediately, eager to agree with anything he said. Alexander continued. Especially in rooms where people think nobody important is watching. Something inside Naomi tightened slightly. Ethan still looked relaxed, even confident. He had no idea the room was beginning to turn around him. Alexander glanced down briefly at the papers on the podium before lifting his eyes toward the crowd again. Tonight, he said carefully, before discussing acquisitions and partnerships, there is someone in this ballroom I would like to acknowledge personally. A tense smile widened instantly. One investor beside him even whispered, "This could be your moment." But Alexander was not looking at Ethan. Not even close. His attention remained locked on the woman standing silently in the silver dress near the back of the ballroom while champagne stains still shimmered beneath the crystal lights. So many people spend their entire lives trying to enter rooms that were never built for them. Naomi Carter used to believe love could build one anyway. Alexander Ali's words lingered over the silent ballroom while dozens of wealthy strangers waited for the name he was about to say. But Naomi already understood something nobody else in that room did. This moment had started long before tonight. Long before the champagne. Long before the marble floors and crystal chandeliers and expensive smiles. It started 10 years earlier inside a tiny apartment over a laundromat in Brooklyn where the pipes rattled every winter and the kitchen window never fully closed. Ethan Whitmore used to sit at a cheap folding table with his sleeves rolled up, staring at spreadsheets until his eyes turned red from exhaustion. Naomi would sit across from him wearing oversized sweatpants, correcting his investor pitches line by line while steam from instant noodles filled the apartment. "Read that paragraph again," she would tell him softly at 2 in the morning while highlighting mistakes with a red pen she always kept behind her ear. Ethan used to laugh back then. Real laughter. Not the polished corporate kind he wore now for investors and cameras. "You are better at this than I am," he told her once while snow tapped gently against the fire escape outside their apartment. Naomi smiled without looking up from the laptop screen. "Then we better make sure you do not embarrass us both tomorrow." Those nights became years. Ethan built the company. Naomi built the structure underneath it. She handled strategy when investors doubted him. She rewrote presentations before meetings. She taught him how to slow down when speaking to executives. She even picked the company slogan during a thunderstorm when the power went out and they brainstormed ideas by candlelight at the kitchen counter. Back then, Ethan introduced her proudly. "This is my wife Naomi," he would say with his hand resting gently at the small of her back. Honestly, she is the smartest person in the room. But success changes insecure people faster than failure ever does. The first thing Ethan upgraded was not his apartment. It was his image. Custom suits replaced thrift store jackets. Private clubs replaced corner diners. New investors entered his life carrying quiet opinions hidden behind expensive smiles. Naomi noticed the shift slowly. One dinner party. Then another. Ethan stopped asking for her opinion during meetings. He interrupted her more often in public. He hired image consultants who suggested Naomi should soften her natural hair for executive events. One woman even handed Naomi a folder filled with luxury fashion recommendations and whispered, "Corporate wives at this level usually present themselves differently." Ethan never defended her. He only looked away. Then came the interviews. Articles describing Ethan as a self-made genius. Magazine covers calling him the sole architect of Whitmore Capital. Naomi's name disappeared entirely. She became invisible beside a success she had helped build with her own hands. And eventually Ethan began treating her the same way the world did. Like an accessory that no longer matched the room. The memory faded as Naomi stood once again beneath the ballroom lights while Alexander Hale remained at the podium watching her carefully. Ethan still had no idea how much history was standing beside him in that silver dress. Because while he spent years trying to become important to powerful people, Naomi had quietly become indispensable to one of the most powerful companies in America. The most dangerous people in a room are usually the quiet ones. Alexander Hale stood beneath the soft blue stage lights with one hand resting against the podium while the ballroom waited for him to continue. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Even the waiters near the back froze in place holding silver trays against their black uniforms. Ethan Whitmore looked almost excited now. Naomi could see it in the way he subtly straightened his shoulders and adjusted the cuff of his tuxedo again. He thought opportunity was standing in front of him. He had no idea judgment already was. Before we begin tonight's announcements, Alexander said calmly, I want to speak briefly about loyalty. The word echoed strangely through the ballroom. Several executives exchanged quick glances. Ethan smiled politely like every other businessman in the room pretending to understand where the conversation was going. Naomi remained silent near the back table, fingers lightly resting against the stem of an untouched water glass while the champagne stains dried slowly across the silver fabric of her dress. Alexander continued speaking with the steady control of someone who never needed to rush his words. In business, people celebrate visible success. The headlines. The profits. The faces on magazine covers. But the truth is, most powerful companies are built by individuals nobody bothers to notice. Naomi lowered her eyes briefly. Ethan did not notice. He was too busy nodding along with the speech while one investor beside him whispered, this is why Hale dominates the industry. The man understands leadership. A faint smile touched Alexander's face for half a second. Unfortunately, he continued, success also has a habit of exposing character. Especially the character of people who forget who helped build them once the spotlight arrives. This time the room became noticeably more uncomfortable. The laughter from earlier felt very far away now. Ethan shifted slightly beside Naomi, confusion flickering across his face for the first time all evening. Then Alexander looked directly toward the back of the ballroom again. Thou wert Naomi. The air almost seemed to tighten around the room. 3 years ago, Alexander said, Hale and Rowe Industries was 48 hours away from financial collapse after a disastrous overseas acquisition. Several investors straightened immediately. Even hearing Alexander Hale admit weakness sounded shocking. Banks were preparing to walk away. Board members were preparing resignations. We hired the best consultants in New York and none of them could solve the problem. Ethan listened carefully now, sensing the importance of the story. Then, Alexander said quietly, someone sent me a 72-page restructuring strategy at 2:13 in the morning. Naomi closed her eyes briefly. She remembered that night perfectly. Rain against the apartment windows. Cold coffee sitting beside her laptop. 40 straight hours awake rewriting numbers until dawn. Alexander's voice softened slightly. No introductions. No ego. No demand for recognition. Used solutions. Ethan finally stopped smiling. Something about the way Alexander spoke now was beginning to feel personal. Very personal. That strategy saved my company, Alexander said. And over the next 3 years, the same person continued advising Hale and Rowe quietly behind the scenes while refusing public credit every single time. Naomi could feel us slowly beginning to shift around the ballroom now. Curious. Searching. The room was trying to figure out who Alexander Hale was talking about. Ethan glanced around confidently at first, probably expecting some famous consultant or executive to stand up at any second. But nobody moved. Alexander reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and removed a folded piece of paper. Tonight, he said carefully, I finally intend to correct that mistake. Then he unfolded the paper slowly and looked directly at Naomi Carter while the entire ballroom unknowingly held its breath. Silence can humiliate people louder than insults ever could. The ballroom stood perfectly still while Alexander Hale held the folded paper in his hand beneath the stage lights. Nobody reached for their drinks anymore. Nobody whispered. The room had shifted into that rare kind of silence wealthy people hated most, the kind where they sensed power moving but did not yet understand where it was going. Isim Bitmore's confidence began fading inch by inch. Naomi could see it happening in real time. His smile no longer looked natural. One hand remained trapped awkwardly near the button of his tuxedo jacket while his eyes flickered nervously between Alexander and the crowd around him. Investors who had been praising him all evening suddenly looked uncertain. Alexander unfolded the paper carefully. The person responsible for restructuring Hale and Rowe Industries, he said calmly, did not ask for recognition. In fact, she specifically requested anonymity. A soft ripple moved through the ballroom. She. Isin frowned immediately. Naomi remained still beside him, her expression unreadable beneath the chandelier light. Alexander continued. Over the last 3 years, this woman quietly negotiated mergers, prevented legal disasters, redesigned international expansion strategy, and personally advised my executive board through some of the most difficult financial decisions in our company's history. Several executives near the front tables exchanged shocked looks now. One older board member even lowered his champagne glass slowly, realization beginning to appear across his face. Isin swallowed hard. Naomi noticed the tiny movement in his throat because she knew him too well. She knew exactly how fear looked on him. Alexander glanced down briefly at the paper again before speaking the next words with absolute clarity. Some of you in this room laughed at her tonight. Nobody moved. Some of you watched her be humiliated and decided to stay silent because protecting status felt safer than protecting dignity. The silence became painful now. Naomi could feel it pressing against every marble wall in the ballroom. The same women who smiled earlier suddenly avoided eye contact. A man near the bar quietly lowered his phone after realizing he had recorded the champagne incident. Ethan's face lost more color with every sentence. And unfortunately, Alexander said softly, one person in particular should be ashamed of himself. Isin froze completely. Naomi finally turned toward him slowly. For the first time all night, she saw genuine panic entering his eyes. Alexander lifted his gaze fully toward the back of the ballroom. Miss Naomi Carter, he said, his voice steady and unmistakable, would you please join me on stage? The room stopped breathing. Isin looked at Naomi as if he had never truly seen her before. Around them, executives stared openly now. Smoke spread across the ballroom in waves. Naomi did not move immediately. She simply stood there in the